I'm Rob Puricelli. I run a website called FailedMuso.com, and in my spare time I like to restore and renovate these wonderful Fairlights. So the talk today is really about the history of Fairlight because it's the 40th anniversary of the sale of the first model, and I wanted just to cover a bit of history, correct some untruths that are out there, expand the story to include the people that don't often get mentioned in those things, and to also have Steve Levine up on stage, who actually used one of these machines to great effect back in the day. So I hope that they get a better understanding of the history of the machine. I hope they get to love this machine a little bit more than maybe they do and as much as I do, and just to come away with a sense of the importance of what this machine means to the music industry in terms of the first sampler and the first screen-based sequencer. My name is Rob Puricelli. I'm the guy behind FailedMuso.com, a lesser-known website, not very popular, but I get some good feedback from it, and I do talk a lot about the Fairlight CMI because it's a little passion of mine. I'm by day, I'm an instructional designer, so I train people either like this or through e-learning. So that's what I do for my day job. But in the time in between that, I like to restore and repair these on behalf of a very dear friend of mine, Mr. Peter Wilk of Horizontal Productions. Peter is based out in Sydney. He's an English guy from Islington. But he worked in the Fairlight studio in Rushcutters Bay in Sydney from the original version of the Fairlight company. So he knows these things inside out. And he was very astute back in the day when Fairlight went bust in '89. He bought up a ton of stock and has been servicing and restoring and repairing ever since. And if you want a Fairlight CMI, he is the guy to go to. I'm just his UK hands, eyes, and ears, basically. So I stand on the shoulders of giants. I am not an expert. I want to get that out there right away, but I'm a fan and I'm an enthusiast. Anybody know who this guy is? Hands up. No, close, but no cigar. Here's for fears, but yeah. Ian Stanley, thank you. So Ian Stanley is an elusive character. Trust me, I tried to track him down, and I got as far as a family member, and they just said, no, he doesn't want to interact with the world anymore, certainly not in this world. But this is the guy that got me into Fairlights actually hands-on, because it was this machine that you see on the right that I first restored. So this had been sat in Chris Hughes's Jacobean studios that he has down in Wiltshire in one of these stone outhouses. And although it was in flight cases, it had become quite corroded, quite smelly. And we actually managed to restore it back to full working order, as you can see in the bottom picture there. And that's in my little bedroom studio at home, which my wife absolutely hates because it's full of stuff like this. So that's what really kind of got me hands-on with these machines after many, many years of just dreaming and looking at pictures on the internet and getting all moist about the gusset. So that's where I am. And of course, my start for the passion of the Fairlight was with this guy. You must remember this clip. Is the wonderful Kieran Prendeville on Tomorrow's World in 1980 when he introduced the CMI to us that used to sit in front of a TV on a Thursday night waiting for Top of the Pops. This comes on and I'm blown away. This thing is making sounds that sound like the actual sounds they're supposed to be making. So problem is that when this was broadcast, he got stuff wrong. Surprise, surprise. He said, these sounds are being generated entirely by the computer. There are no recordings involved. It's a sampler. Of course there are recordings. So the misinformation and the myths about the Fairlight started way back at the very, very beginning, and they've just snowballed over the years. So I do try to set those straight in the most polite way I can muster when you're discussing things on forums on the internet. So I just want to give you a little bit of a history about how the Fairlight came to be, because again, there's a little bit of misinformation and a lack of information in certain cases. Forgive the puns, I get bored. All Furze in Love and War refers to a guy called Tony Furze, and we'll come to him in just a minute. But you probably recognize these two guys, Kim Ryrie and on the right, Peter Vogel. Somebody who I actually am so honored to actually call a friend these days. He's a brilliant, brilliant man. And when you get a phone call from him, it's like somebody getting a phone call from Bob Moog. It's just mind-blowing. So these guys set out in the early 1970s to create a synthesizer that could make natural acoustic sounds. They wanted, like every synth manufacturer back then, wanted to recreate cellos, oboes, pianos, strings, and they wanted to do it completely electronically. Everyone at the time was using subtractive analog synthesis. They thought, how about we use additive synthesis and regenerate the harmonics of a natural acoustic instrument within a computer? So they were trying lots of different things. Peter is a genius, but he just couldn't figure out how to make these natural acoustic sounds using additive synthesis and harmonics. But there's one guy that doesn't often get mentioned. And the reason I want to mention it is because he emailed me a few years ago and very abruptly told me that he should be included in this story because he's often left out. And so, in respect to him, that's what I want to do. This guy is called Tony Furze. Now, Tony Furze was an employee of RCA, and he was based in Canberra in Australia. And he was working with all sorts of electronic technology, and he had the same idea as Vogel and Ryrie. He wanted to create an electronic instrument that could make natural acoustic sounds using additive synthesis. And Tony is leaning against the Qasar. This is the Qasar 2. There was a Qasar 1, but there literally, I think, was only one of the Qasar ones. I always used to call it the Qasar because I'm very particular. There's no U, but apparently it is called the Qasar. Now, this was an additive synthesis, and it's a weird-looking thing. I often think that maybe somebody like Ross Lamont should actually create one of these with a Euro rack at the top. That would be quite nice. But it was an awful machine, and it sounded terrible. Now, given the audio glitches we're having, I'm not entirely sure if we're going to get any audio from this. But if you Google Lindsay Blue plays the Qasar on YouTube, you'll be treated to the most god-awful din that you've ever heard. And it's peculiar because he's playing this Qasar to a guy with a scarf and a cardigan, smoking a cigarette with lots of hair, just sat there in front of this thing like it's the most wonderful thing he's ever heard. It's awful. So it wasn't working. So because of Tony's link to RCA, he was able to get hold of microprocessors very easily. And he got hold of this brand new microprocessor called the Motorola 6800. And he decided to try and use computing. He thought maybe computers can compute those complex harmonics to give us that natural sound. So he built this machine here that you see. This is Tony on the left, stood next to what is known as the Multimode 8. And it's a very large dual processor computer with absolutely no PCBs in it whatsoever. It's all wire wrapped. And I've never seen inside of one, but I've been told that it's a god-awful mess. But he was trying to use computer technology to make these things work. And as you see, the guy on the right who's doing some testing, you'll notice that he's actually using a light pen, which is something that if you're familiar with the Fairlight, you'll actually recognize that technology was already there. So Vogel and Ryrie get wind of this. They travel down to Canberra, they see Tony, they have a look at this, and they're very interested, particularly Peter Vogel, very interested in the fact they're using microprocessors. So they do a licensing agreement with Tony and say, can we license your stuff? We'll take it away and see what we can do. So the first thing they do is they have PCBs created for all the functions. So it manages to get the size of this machine down because it is a considerable beast. Those drives on the right-hand side are 8-inch drives. So they're already this tall, and then there's that much on top. But you might notice, if you are familiar with the CMI, certainly the Series 1 and Series 2s, that there is a very familiar look about this machine. Drives on the right, processor switches on the left. That's it from both sides. I must call out the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney, who are very gracious in letting me have these images to share with you today. Well, they've got some really good stuff on there, so if you're interested, go and have a look. So the first job was to condense it down, to make it work more efficiently. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the very first CMI, the Qasar CMI, dual processor system. Now we see something that is looking very, very Fairlighty. 2 drives on the right, processor switches on the left, front panel that drops down to reveal a digital card cage with all the PCBs in. This lovely new clean design, all that metalwork designed and fabricated by a gentleman called Alan Galt, who sadly left us a couple of years ago. But he went on to build and fabricate every single Fairlight that left the factory, all 300 odd of them over the years. It was his metalwork, it was his monitor designs. He's a very important guy in this story. So that was the Qasar CMI. Unfortunately, it still didn't do what they wanted it to do. It made awful sounds that were nothing like the real things. So one day Peter Vogel thinks, I wonder if I can record the sound and play it back. So that's what he tried to do. Now, ADCs and DACs were not readily available off the shelf back in the late 70s, so he had to build his own analog to digital converters and digital to analog converters, but he did so. He hooked it up to the memory and was able to record a sound and store it as ones and zeros in the RAM. Then he had to figure out how are we going to pitch this up and down so we can actually play a chromatic scale on this thing. So he came up with the concept of adjusting the clock speed. Faster clock speed, higher pitch, lower clock speed, lower pitch. But you start drifting 2 or 3 semitones either side of the root note, and you start to get noise, artifacts, aliasing, as they call it. So again, Peter had to come up with an idea, how do we get rid of this? So analog filters, we can use those to put the sound through and then just roll off, so we just get rid of those frequencies. But of course, those frequencies change on every note you play. So the system has to be able to calculate not only the clock speed based on the note you've pressed on the keyboard, but the amount of filtering that needs to be applied to that particular sound based on its pitch. There's a lot going on in here, and this is obviously very early days. You know, we don't necessarily have to worry about any of that at all in modern day sampling. So he did it, and it was successful. It sounded rough, but it was there. And the dog sample, which is the very famous first sample, sounded like the dog. The piano sample sounded like the piano. So he was on to a winner. And so they pressed ahead, they recruited more people, they set up the business properly, and they started producing and taking the Fairlight out on the road. The first thing that happened is a completely fortuitous event. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Elvis's music director was called Bruce Jackson, I believe, and Bruce was an Australian. Bruce's mum lived next door to Kim Ryrie. Bruce comes home in 77, 78 after Elvis has left us and says, I've got nothing to do. And his mum says, there's these 2 guys next door that are working on some kind of instrument. Maybe you should go and see them. So off he pops and he goes to see Kim and Peter, and he's blown away because he has a huge amount of contacts in the music industry in America. So they get the Fairlight, pack it up, take it to LA. They show it to Stevie Wonder. In the room at the time is Larry Fast, who you probably know from his work with Peter Gabriel, amongst others. Larry gets on the phone to Peter Gabriel, says, you've got to hear this. And so this chain of events happens, and we get the Fairlight actually out in the open. Of course, in the UK, Psycho Systems was run by Peter Gabriel and Steve Payne, again, sadly no longer with us. And that's where the whole thing took off. And then we start to see the Qasar looking a bit more Fairlighty. You can see the card cage there, the monitor, that wonderful hospital beige. That's the actual name of the paint. We have cans of it. They still make it. Light pens, and of course, in 1979, we have the Series 1, although it's just called the Fairlight CMI. And you can spot a Fairlight Series 1. If you look on the front of the mainframe, there's a rotary knob. It's a terminal baud rate adjuster that goes from 0 to 9600 or something. It does nothing, but they just left it there because it was... And you'll find that with Fairlights. There are elements of the Fairlight that just don't do anything. They just didn't remove it, like the additive synthesis. So this just changed the world in terms of sampling. A couple of years later, 2 or 3 years later, we have the Series 2, and then a year after that, the 2X. Does anybody know the difference between the 2 and the 2X? Sorry? The X, yeah, good, nice, thank you. 4 letters, MIDI, thank you very much. MIDI was the big difference, and they implemented it. In fact, the way that the Fairlight keyboard communicated with the CPU was pretty much 99% of what the standard MIDI specification was. They just didn't know it at the time. And when the big 5, I think it was, sat down, it was a pretty easy job to fit MIDI as a standard to this. 1985, we see the Series 3. Now, that's what we see here, albeit in a slightly different form. This is the rack mount version that was produced much later in the range, towards 89 and beyond for a few years. The Series 3 gave us 16-bit. It was much more powerful. It had a whopping 114 megabyte Winchester hard drive, which is more than enough for these machines. Still had a floppy disk drive, also had a tape drive for backup. And this was the one, the fabled one, that could potentially cost you up to £100,000, but mostly they were 20 to 50. Peanuts. They did away with the light pen on the Series 3, and they replaced it with the graphics tablet, which is equally bad, and I never use it. But they actually, in 1985, Fairlight introduced for the first time pitch bend and mod wheels. Before that, it was just unfixed sliders that you could assign to pitch bend if you wanted to, but there was no way of accurately getting it back. So for the first time in 85, Fairlight went with the crowd and went with a pitch bend and mod wheel. So, bit of a timeline. 75, the M8 CMI, 79, the Series 1, 82, the Series 2, 83, the 2X, 85, the Series 3. And then we come on to the last years of the actual original Fairlight company. Between 89 and around 93, they carried on producing systems much like this because that was the market. It was post-production studios, and they wanted things they could just shove in racks. The first MFX was a Series 3 CMI plus hard disk recording. 1989, 24-track digital hard disk recording at 16-bit. Pretty impressive stuff. They enhanced it. After 89, Fairlight went bust. They started up another company called Fairlight ESP, Electric Sound Picture. And that ran for 2 or 3 more years before that went belly up and got bought out by the company that ran it until a few years ago. And then the next incarnation of the CMI was the fabled 30A, of which 14 exist. I've only ever seen one. And it was Peter Vogel's little attempt at trying to create something new. It did 32-bit floating point. It had a goodness switch, so you could go from 8-bit to 32-bit on anything you used. Fully compatible with all the old libraries, but still cost a princely £16,000. Again, all hand-built by Alan Galt. Unfortunately, due to some legal wranglings, which I won't go into here, only 14 of the 100 planned were ever made. And they do exchange hands every now and again on places like Vimeo and on eBay, in fact, for some considerable sums of money. Here's another example of misinformation. Have we got anybody here from Electronic Sound magazine? Good. Right. First of all, Electronic Sound magazine is a very good magazine. Other magazines are available, considering our hosts. But they ran a piece a few months ago on the Fairlight. And I opened up the page, eagerly opened up the page, because Peter had said, I've done this interview with these guys, and they're only down the road from me in Norwich. And I opened it up to be presented with this as a representative picture of the Fairlight CMI. So any of you that use Arturia plugins should recognize that is their virtual recreation image. So you can see on the left-hand side, we've got 3 times the amount of buttons and sliders. We've got this mythical fader attachment. And we've also got an SD card drive on the mainframe unit itself, which we do use, and they're very good. But what this does, and I actually emailed the editor, and we had a bit of an exchange, and he hasn't contacted me again since. I was very polite, I promise. But this doesn't help the cause of history. And I'm very particular about this. I know that in a year or two's time, somebody's going to come to me and say, I want a Fairlight CMI, and we're going to provide them with one. And they're going to go, where's that mixer board? It's only got 2 buttons, because that is what happens. So this is why I do stuff like this, because I want to set records straight. So we'll forgive them that. 2 things that the Fairlight gave us that we still use today is graphical on-screen sequencing and sampling. Quick straw poll, hands up, anybody in this room who has used at some point in their musical endeavors a computer-based sequencer, whether it's Cubase, Live, Reason, whatever, hands up. Yeah. Hands up who uses digital samples. Again, massive hands. You have this machine. This is ground zero. This is what gave us the ability to do all of that stuff. Here's a price list from 1983 from Psycho. £21,500 for a Series 2. You could downgrade to Series 1 voice cards and save yourself 500 quid. Actually, the Series 1 voice cards are quite sought after. My 2X at home has a a set of Series 1 cards, and they do have a quality. Here's some extras. £85 for a pack of 10 discs. No wonder these things were expensive, but you can see that there's a lot of expense, and so people really fell for the Fairlight, but they just didn't want to spend 25 grand on one. And who could blame them? Because back then, 25 grand could buy you property in most places around the country, probably not London. So we start with the Fairlight, and then companies say, well, let's see if we can just do some sampling. So you get companies like Emu spring up, and Akai later on, and Sonic, and a whole bunch of others. And then you get companies like Steinberg, eMagic, and a whole bunch of others that are doing sequencing software. So the two forms split. And now we have samplers and sequencers. And anybody that was around in the 90s making music was probably using a computer like an Atari ST and an Akai S1000 or whatever it might have been, an EMU. They came back together for a little bit because we found that we could actually edit those samples in a computer. So you had, for example, the Mac here, you had, was it Sound Magic, or there was Sound Diver as well. There's all these different things that you could manipulate and then send them back to your sampler. But they pretty much stayed separate entities right through until the turn of the century. So we had rack mount samplers, we had digital audio workstations. But around the early 2000s, they all came back together, and we now have software sampling, software sequencing, all back in the box. So we've come full circle. But what we do now is what this machine here introduced for the first time ever. And I'm very passionate about making sure that I try and teach kids about this. This is where it all started. If you make music on a laptop, you have this machine to thank for that. Well, not this particular one, but you have this concept to thank for that. And there it is. That, for me, is peak Fairlight. That's the real deal. That's a Series 2X. If you ask me, that's the best one of the bunch. These are lovely, powerful, but too clean. So how did it change everything? Here is Page R, the first on-screen sequencer based in the computer. 8 tracks of monophonic playback. It was only ever designed to be a rhythm sequencer. It was only ever designed to do drum patterns. Clever people said, oh, I can do a bass line on there. Maybe a little top-line melody, maybe some arpeggios, and they started getting creative. And I think it was Peter Gabriel that said, we need creative restrictions for us to flourish and think of ways around it. Well, this is what happened here. But if you look at that design, on the left-hand side, we have our tracks, our track numbers and our track names, and then we have the strips, the audio for the MIDI data, should I say. And if we look at pretty much any sequencer nowadays, unless you're Ableton Live, and that's slightly different, most of these follow the same pattern to this day. And of course, sampling. Digital sampling started with the Fairlight. It was the first commercial digital sampler. It started very rough, 8-bit, 14 kilohertz, goes up to these machines, 16-bit, 100 kilohertz, and of course nowadays with the software samplers that we have with 24-bit, 96, 192, we need all of that. You don't notice it in the mix. But of course, from the Fairlight, ideas sprung in people's imaginations, such as the EMU emulators, the Ensoniq Mirages, and of course the classic Akais, of which I own 3. I still love them. They're great machines. And they took charge, and the Fairlight just couldn't keep up in terms of technology, and of course, the most important thing, price. And of course, nowadays, this is a very familiar sight on most people's digital audio workstations, a software sampler. But I do hope that some of you maintain the use of hardware, particularly with sampling. Nothing quite like it. So, shall we have a listen to some classic Fairlight sounds? That's Syrah, or R1, as it was known on some libraries. Sarah Cohen is the name of the lady whose voice that is. It was recorded in 1981 and then just stretched across the keyboard and was used by everyone, particularly Art of Noise and Tears for Fears, and I won't try and play any of that because I'm one of these people that punches one note in at a time. So that's Syrah or Sarah or R. So that's a nice one. Let's go back to our directory. So this is where you see where you have to kind of unlearn what you do with sampling with a Fairlight, because everything is key driven. You can use the pointer, but it really is very slow. So let's, of course, there's one sound I think that we all know and love that was used all over the shop. Are you ready? I've actually got the record, not the actual record, but the exact same copy of Stravinsky's Firebird Suite. There's a particular recording of it that was used by, I think it was David Vorhaus that actually did the sample. And it's just uncanny that you can actually do that. But there's still something about that that gets, it's like the DX7 electric piano. Hands up who loves the DX7 electric piano. Oh, okay. I love and it just evokes something nice. What else have we got? Oh, I'll tell you what, let's do this one. You'll love this, I'm sure. Now, this actually wasn't part of the original studio library. But what used to happen was people would use the Fairlight, make their own samples, and then send them back to Fairlight in Australia. And then they'd somehow find their ways into the factory library. Because back then, the legal thing wasn't really a thing. Anyway, let's load this one and see if I can remember how this goes. Owner of a Lonely Heart. Krypton Factor. I think that used that there as well. So, yeah, Cool Stab. And of course, then there was another one which was used aplenty. I should be advancing my slides here. Let's do this one first. The old Koto bend. And then, of course, Thomas Dolby was a very prolific user of the Fairlight. And one of the sounds he used to use quite a bit was this one. Can I just say at this moment, I am so happy this thing is playing ball today. Did you work on that one? China Crisis? I know you worked, yeah. How embarrassing is this? So that's the Swanee whistle. We had Koto Bend, we've had Cool Stab. Aha, right. So those of you who are fans of the Fairlight Series 3 might want to hear some of these sounds. Now, I forget the guy's surname. I hope he's not here because that would be really embarrassing. Adam, who does these brilliant videos on YouTube, and he did this brilliant 20-minute Terminator 2 soundtrack analysis. If you haven't seen it, watch it. It's brilliant. And he didn't have access to a CMI, but he spoke to a friend of mine in Australia who got one and did this really big analysis of Brad Friedel's use of the CMI throughout the entire soundtrack. And of course, this very famous sound, which I've talked about now, so let's do this. And it's a great use. This is a really good example of how the Fairlight really got people to be inventive with just regular sounds. It's that wonderful thing about sampling. You just take a regular sample, and it sounds like it's supposed to sound. It's just a pretty disinteresting brass fall. I'll be back. And it just takes on this whole other quality. If you'd have said to me years ago, that's a brass fall, that's a bunch of trumpets. No, that's been created in some fantastic machine. No, it's just a brass fall pitched down about 3 octaves. With a bit of delay and reverb, you get the picture. Again, from that same movie. And this was that metallic sound that announced various elements of the Terminator's process. And it's just an anvil. It's a hammer on an anvil. And it just takes on this whole other quality that's just really interesting. I would like to introduce onto the stage Mr. Steve Levine. Give him a round of applause. Lovely to meet you.
You'll be this side.
So, first of all, I have to say big thank you to the guys at SOS for setting this up, because it was not planned, but it was very, very welcome. So let me just grab some questions here. Just a brief synopsis. In case you don't know who Steve Levine is, he's a Grammy and Brit Award winning producer, author, public speaker involved with PRS, and of course famously known for your work with Culture Club, Beach Boys, China Crisis, Gary Moore, and many others.
And the mood.
Yeah, the mood. So, your experience with the Fairlight, when did it start?
It started with the Series 2,
Uh-huh.
with Psychosystems. I'd been an early adopter and had one of the very first Lindrum machines in the UK. And so my original setup was Lindrum to do the drums, and I used a Roland MC4 and a few analog synths at the time. And as you say, the holy grail of, well, these drum sounds are really good. It enabled me to do demos in places that were not normal studios, so I could kind of up my game. And like everybody, I'd heard about the Peter Gabriel, and the Fairlight. And so my relationship was slightly different because I was starting doing some demos for EMI Records, and I just started doing the demos for Culture Club at EMI Studios, not Abbey Road, the studio that's in Manchester Square. And it's a really interesting set of circumstances. So we were working on the first track, and I was also working with another artist called Honey Bain, who was a punk artist. And I wanted some trumpets on the track. It's funny you play that full, because we have a very similar sample. That actually isn't one of mine, but some of them were mine. And so Julian Lindsay was the keyboard player with Honey Bain, and he said, I know a great trumpet player. And I said, well, what has he done? And he said, well, he's just done Teardrop Explodes. So if you remember Reward, that is one person, Terry Bailey, playing all those trumpets. I said, yeah, that's a good sound. Let me get that down. So Terry came and played trumpet. And Julian said, I need to introduce you to my friend Michael Kelly, because they were all from Bath and the Bristol area. Michael Kelly is setting up this new company called Psycho with Peter Gabriel and Stephen Payne. Yep. They're going to have the Fairlight. So Julian was the one that introduced me to Michael Kelly and Stephen Payne, and it's coincided with the start of Culture Club's career going up, and therefore me getting some money. Yep. You mentioned the price. My first flat in London was £19,000, and my first Fairlight was £28,000. So actually it was... so the thing about the Fairlight was that, as I discovered with the Lindrum, I mean, there was still only of the Lin 1. There were only 500 of those ever made in the entire world, and I still have mine. I don't have my Fairlight anymore, but the point about the Fairlight is that the turnover was so fast, so in order to have an edge on your competitors, I needed to invest in the Fairlight. And of course, having the Fairlight, for me, one of the most important things, not just the ability to sample, because essentially we were still analog recording. It was 24 track at that point, although it moved to 48 soon after. It was the ability to use Page-R as a sequencer, and we used that an awful lot. And on many of the Culture Club recordings, we would do some basic elements with John, because the great thing about John, which I only discovered so much later, was John Moss, the drummer in Culture Club, was a phenomenally tight drummer. Most drummers today are really tight, but in those days it was quite hard. And I remember doing the first few things with him, and it was seamless between samples, programming, and playing. Yeah. And the first time it dawned on me how good John was and how that didn't work was just before I worked with The Mood, I was also asked to work with Kajagoogoo, who did their demos. And they said, we love the sound you're getting with all this programming. So I said, well, this is kind of how I do it. And with the greatest respect, their drummer wasn't John Moss. And the first session really did sound like somebody throwing cutlery down the stairs. It was just so out of time. And you realize that one of the reasons some of my records sounded so good was because those musicians understood the technology in a way that most of this generation today do understand. Yeah. But in those days, it was quite new.
So how do you actually, you said you started off with the Roland and the Lindrum, so how did you then integrate the Fairlight into your workflow that you then developed over the years?
It depended on the track, and it also depended on the artist. So, for example, an artist like China Crisis, where it was all synthesizers anyway, they wanted to bring realism into it. So a lot of the sounds, the plucky sounds, were real things. They might be a little bit of a piano. But one of the big uses of it was I produced a band called Jimmy the Hoover, and they had, our big hit was Tantalize. Yeah. A large chunk of that were African-sounding instruments, because they loved African high life. So all those marimbas and things were both the Fairlight, and at that point I'd also had the first emulator as well. So it was a combination of the two. So for me, I sampled real instruments, and one of the things that I used to do to get around the sampling limitations was I recorded to analog tape the samples I wanted, played the tape back at half speed, sampled lower. I could then get a greater fidelity. Oh, wow. And so fortunately I have still got some of my source samples because of I always sampled it first, and I for those that realise, getting the level in this thing was really, really hard. So sampling live was always a difficulty. So I would often sample first and then work out, which was the best bit, and then I could spend a few moments getting the level dead right or compressing it, trying to make this thing sound as good as it possibly could. Yeah. And you're right that Stephen Payne actually had a load of, from Psycho, I gave him a load of my original samples because they existed on tape, and therefore some of them made their way into the system.
It's always amazing that there are many arguments online about the names of certain samples, but people don't realise how fluid that factory library became because artists and producers were swapping and sending.
It was actually also a way of showing off.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like, and I remember having these conversations with Trevor Horn. It was a showing off of samples. Yeah. It was like a kind of trade,
Yeah, absolutely. So what was your first kind of wow moment? When did you realise this is going to change everything?
That's hard to say. I think when I listened back to the precision of Page R, I think that was the moment because I thought, wow, this sounds really, really good. And you mentioned I had the Series 2 and then I had the upgrade to run on MIDI. But even before it ran on MIDI, the Lin 1 had a really brilliant thing on the back that you could change the clock pulses. And I also had some modifications made to mine. So Dave Simmons of Simmons Drums put an analog interface with the 15-volt triggers, plus I used to get all my Oberheim stuff from Chase Electronics, and they had a great engineer there, and he put in some additional clocks, so I could run everything in sync, even at that early stage. And it was then when you hear, the Fairlight doing this, and the Lin drum doing that, and something else doing this, it's like, there's a setup, in fact. That's actually the Lin 2. And I had that thing you mentioned in your list, the thing called the conductor, which was like a box with loads of jacks on it, which had different pulses and things. And so you could lock a lot of things together really easily. You press play and bam. And I think that was the you go, wow, that's a really, really good template. And then the majority of the other instruments were played on top of that, real bass and whatever. But it gave me, that's at Red Bus Studios, and that pretty much became my home for most of the Culture Club records and many of the other things that I did in new work there as well. So, but I think that it was the fact, the fidelity and the timing. And you could also take bands that didn't necessarily have a huge amount of studio experience, and you could kind of give them, George mentioned this state. It was like giving people shoulder pads. It was like it just gave them a bit more oomph.
Class, yeah. So synchronization was always an issue.
Yeah.
How did you synchronize your equipment? Was it just purely through the things you've just mentioned, or did you use the Friendship SRCs?
I did, and in fact, the Friendship has. I'm going to have to name drop like mad now. So the Friendship, you're absolutely right. So those that don't know, you put some SMPTE code on tape, and then this box. Have you got a picture of Friendship?
I haven't. No.
So the Friendship was a unit that had multiple clock outputs, and these are basic, standard 16 triggers and varying degrees of those. So by putting the code down, you could then run everything from that, and that was as I locked everything together and packed all my stuff away to start my recordings with the Beach Boys in California. And at this point, I was on Series 2X, and I had the conductor. In fact, there are some pictures. I think you can almost see the conductor in the corner, in that rack next to... That's Julian, by the way.
Yeah.
So I get a call in the studio. Julian picks the phone up, and he says, Stevie Wonder's on the phone for you. What? So, yeah. He said, hey, Steve, I hear you're in town with the Beach Boys. He said, you've got, now this is how great Stevie is on technology. He said, you've got an SLC, haven't you? I said, yeah. He said, I've got this problem. He said, I'm trying to sync two Lin drums together and I can't do it. He said, would you come up to the house and help me? And so Julian, I thought, what's just happened? So the next day, we drive up to Stevie's house, and he's got the two Lin drums, Lin 1s, unmodified like mine were. And he said, look, here's my problem. And the thing that's amazing with Stevie Wonder is you forget that he's a blind musician, because he knows his way around his house incredibly well, but he also knows his way around the gear really well. He's learnt where every button is. And at the beginnings of technology, there weren't the graphic display, so most of it was physical. So he said, look, let me play the beat. I've got this beat here, and I've got that there. And he said, because one of the limitations of the Lin was you couldn't use the congas at the same time as the voices were limited. So if you wanted like a really busy tom-tom pattern, it used the same voices as the congas. It couldn't have both. So he had one doing like the beat with toms and one doing all percussion, tambourines, congas, and all the rest of it. He said, they're not running in sync. I can't get them to run in sync. Now, I knew what the problem was because the Friendship was designed in Germany, and Europe uses 25 frames, and America uses 30 frames. And when it boots up, it boots to 25 frames. So I said, look, Stevie, here's what you do. You hold the button down and press those two, bam. So then he said to me, well, do you want a song for the Beach Boys? And I went, absolutely. So Stevie came and did a song. What was amazing about that session was I also, in that picture, there's a PPG. And Stevie had a PPG, which he used to use a lot for certain parts. But he'd had his modified so that every time he moved a cursor button, it bleeped, and mine didn't have that. And on one particular case, Carl was there tuning something, and Stevie said, I'm lost, because he remembered how many button pushes. And in fact, the other thing that was really funny was he'd also learned about the bleep. So Julian and I were programming the drums, and he was programming, and he'd say, okay, can you just double that to 4 bars? And he'd go, like that. Play another bit, and you go, okay, can you make that 8 bars? And you go, beep. And we were like both like quite nervous. And, because Steve Vaughn is a massive hero of mine. I'm sat next to him programming a bloody track. And he said, okay, Steve, can you just copy that twice? And those that don't know, on the Lin, if you hold the button down too long, you get a longer bleep, which means you've just erased the pattern. and as I did it, I held the button down too long, and it went beep. And he said to me, so do you want me to record that again then? which is just so funny. But the point of the sessions there with the Beach Boys is that Brian Wilson, although in history, you talk about history, Brian never had a Fairlight, it was my Fairlight. But the great thing about Brian was that he wanted to use that technology on those sessions. It was absolutely crucial to him because he also was a pioneer, or he still is, a pioneer of recording techniques. So that was very much part of those sessions. Talking of costs, so I got one of the very first Series 3. Michael Kelly phoned me and said, we're getting Series 3s in. You're going to have to pay cash because there was, as you mentioned, there was some really difficult financial situations with Fairlight. And I think they bought all the stock and there was an issue. So I was in the position where I didn't have 50 grand like that. But I did have an Aston Martin. So it was no competition. So I thought, I'd made some money by then, and I did treat myself to an Aston Martin. I'd spent a year in France working with some American bands, and I thought, you know what, I'll sell it. So Aston Martin phoned me and said, do you want to sell it back to us? And I went, yeah. And they said, we'll pay you exactly what you paid for. And I thought, why's that? Why's that then? So I had 50 grand, gave it to Michael Kelly, bought that. Then 2 weeks later, I see a press shot of the Living Daylights with my car. So my car is the one in the Living Daylights. Same number plate as well, B541WU. So, and it had the very first CD player in it as well. But so that's why I think Sound and Son did that, because I was pretty much the first one with one of those. And that was, another move forward.
Did that really change more?
It was more pain in the arse because it actually went wrong a lot more. I can't remember a time when the CMI 2 ever let me down. That let me down a lot, including when we were about to go live on Ray Whistle Test.
Right, yes.
And Steve Rance from Psycho came down with every spare part that he possessed to try it anyway. So that was, I think it was because it was at the time pushing the envelope so far.
Yes.
It really was running out of horsepower, and that became, so I did do some great stuff on it, no question about it. It was a really creative instrument, and to have that level of fidelity, which still at the time was better than the Akai's, but it was a very unreliable machine compared to the Series 2.
And I can vouch for that. These things are temperamental, to say the least. But some of the things that we've done to these now, so we put 32 meg of RAM in on a single card, so it's just basically a PCB with a DIMMs slot, and we just put a single 32 meg, so that helps. We use the SD card drives, but these things can be very temperamental, which was why I was panicking up here earlier, because I couldn't hear to make sure this had actually traveled.
And the heat. So in my studio there, I had some ducts, to kind of keep it cool.
This is quite interesting. These have fans on the back, and these were designed to be put into racks, so obviously ventilation is very important. And these things run a lot cooler than those desktop versions. Desktops, not really on a desktop, but stunning stuff. What do you think the legacy is today? I mean, I mentioned earlier that sampling and sequencing owe everything to this. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I would. You summed it up exceptionally well. I think that not only do we owe a lot to the technology of sampling, but also, as you quite rightly pointed out, we take for granted the amount of design work that goes into the graphic user interface. That is incredibly important. And the basic interface they designed actually is the way that we use today. And you didn't show it on some of the pictures, but for those that know, the editing page, when you edit samples in the Fairlight, especially when you did it with Series 2 with the pen, the whole point of having the axis and the waveform and where you edit, also looping. You know, let's not forget the whole principle. These samples were quite short, so they had to develop looping and crossfading, all of that knowledge and technology. Once someone shows you, it's like having 4 wheels on a car. Once someone's put the 4 wheels, you go, round wheels, you know. And I think that the technology that they developed was such that it really enabled smaller companies to take their ideas and run with them. And then take them to the next level. So I think we owe a huge amount to Kim. I think we also owe a lot to Roger Lynn as well, because I think I interviewed Roger Lynn for one of my radio shows, and he was saying that he and Roger Nichols, they all attended this course that showed about basic computer programming. And I think that it was one of those things where it started these young minds moving. I mean, the only piece of trivia I have with this particular Fairlight was that I did the music to Network 7.
Oh, yeah.
And because I was having so much problem with this machine, I was phoning Australia a lot and getting some help, you know, with different things. They'd send little parts out or new software updates. And so Janet Street Porter was the producer of Network 7, and I'd been working with Zig Zig Sputnik using this, and she came in and she went, "Oh my God, this is so fucking great. You know, I want you to," sorry, I know I love it to bits. And so she said, "I want you to do this new program." Now, she had done a deal with ITV, and she said, "So how does this sampling work? You know, I'll get you stuff." So she got me video after video of stuff that I could use. And the only issue that we couldn't, so if you ever seen Network 7, it's online, but it's a mashup of stuff. Yeah. So the Fairlight was the perfect machine. Yeah. And we could use anything from all these tapes that she gave me. They'd all been cleared by ITV to use. The only problem was that she wanted a piece of Dame Edna with I think she was doing like a model making thing. But she said, "You can't use the audio for that. That's the only restriction. We can use the footage, so we need something in the music to do it." So I thought, I need an Australian voice. So the voice on Network 7 at the beginning that goes, "G'day, mate, how you going?" is actually Kim, because I said to Kim, "I've got to do this Network 7 thing. Well, I've got you on the phone. Can you just say "G'day, mate" to go with a piece of Dame Edna? So it's Dame Edna's image, but it's actually Kim doing the voice. So that was my final trivia for using Anyway, so Network 7, and I think we did it must exist somewhere. Paul Hardcastle, which was a Synclavier user, and me being a fellow, we did like a live fight where we could tape anything off the charts, and we'd have to make a record at the end of the show for Synclavier versus Fairlight.
Wow.
It must exist somewhere.
Steve, thank you very, very much
pleasure.
indeed. Big round of applause. And